Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take a stack of research articles and notes and pull out the most important, surprising, and useful insights just for you.
That's the goal.
Today, we're diving into something that touches so many lives, understanding learning disabilities. But, we're not just looking at the surface level struggle.
No, we want to go deeper.
We're going deep into the why, exploring the neurocognitive underpinnings, the brain's own blueprint for how we learn, and how it can sometimes be a little different.
And we've got a wealth of material here that explores the brain's role, looking at, the structure, how different areas function, how they connect.
Yeah.
Our mission today is really to distill this research into clear, actionable insights. We want to help you get truly well-informed about the brain-based differences underlying these learning challenges.
Absolutely. Think of this deep dive as like your personal shortcut to understand what the science is saying. If you, or maybe someone you care about, has navigated learning differences, this perspective, it can be a game changer.
It really can.
It moves the conversation away from effort or intelligence and squarely onto how the brain processes information.
Exactly. This neurocognitive lens is it's crucial. It helps us understand the root causes, not just describe the difficulties people are having.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We probably need to start with a solid understanding of what a learning disability is, formally, because that definition is key, right? It gets misunderstood a lot.
It really does. So in official terms, like the ones used in education law, a specific learning disability, or SLD, is a disorder affecting one or more of the basic psychological processes, things involved in understanding or using language spoken or written.
Okay, so like listening, thinking.
Yeah, listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, even math calculations. It covers a lot.
So it's about those fundamental processes the brain uses to learn, not just, barming a test.
Precisely.
And it's just as important to clarify what it isn't based on the sources.
Absolutely crucial. These are intrinsic, meaning they originate from within the individual, and they're considered neurobiological, brain-based.
Intrinsic, neurobiological, got it.
And they're not primarily caused by things like vision or hearing problems or intellectual disability, emotional challenges, or simply, environmental or economic disadvantage. That helps zero in on the brain as the core difference.
Okay, that distinction is super important, but learning disability, it still feels like such a broad term. Must be a lot of variation under that umbrella.
Oh, immense variation, yeah. You'll most commonly hear about dyslexia for reading challenges, dysgraphia for writing, and dyscalculia for math.
Those are the big three, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. But there are others, too, impacting how the brain processes auditory information, language itself, nonverbal cues, or even visual motor skills. Each person's profile is really quite unique.
And the numbers are pretty staggering when you look at prevalence.
They really are. Estimates suggest maybe as many as 1 in 5 people in the U.S. might experience some form of learning difference. And, nearly 1 million school kids receive specific services for LDs. It's far more common than many people realize.
Wow, 1 in 5. And one of the most critical points the research hammers home that really needs to resonate with people is about intelligence.
This is the foundational distinction. It's so important. Individuals with learning disabilities typically have average or often above average intelligence.
Right?
Their brains are just wired differently for specific types of information processing. It is absolutely not a reflection of their overall cognitive capacity or, how smart they are.
That's a vital message.
Yeah.
So we're moving away from older ideas that relied on like a big gap between IQ and performance scores.
Exactly. The current diagnostic approaches, like in the DSM-5, talk about specific learning disorder with specifiers for the areas of impairment, reading, writing, math.
And what's the focus there?
It focuses on persistent difficulties, even when someone's getting targeted support. Skills that are substantially below what's expected for their age, causing real challenges in, school, work, daily life.
And it still rules out those other potential primary causes.
Yes, it maintains those exclusion criteria, which consistently points back towards an intrinsic neurobiological origin. That's why comprehensive evaluations looking at neurocognitive factors are so important.
Okay. So the complexity in defining it really mirrors the complexity of the brain itself. It sounds like understanding the brain is pretty much the only way to truly get at the root cause, rather than just observing the difficulties.
I think that's right, yeah. Because there's so much variety, And our understanding is constantly evolving. Researchers need to explore both the specific brain and cognitive patterns for different types of learning disabilities.
Like dyslexia versus dyscalculia.
Exactly. And also look for common threads, neurocognitive markers that might show up across different types of LDs, finding both the unique and the shared patterns.
Let's start with what the brain looks like, generally speaking. We've said these are neurodevelopmental conditions. What does that actually mean in terms of brain structure?
It means these differences originate as the brain is developing, often very early on. And brain imaging studies, like MRI, show there can be structural variation.
Like what kind of variations?
Well, we sometimes see things like differences in the volume of gray matter, that's the brain's processing tissue in certain areas linked to specific learning skills. And these could potentially be very early indicators, biomarkers even.
So differences in the brain's physical makeup, basically.
Yes. And the research highlights things like malformations of cortical development, or MCDs. These are disruptions in how neurons form or migrate very early in development.
So problems during the brain's construction phase.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And while not every learning disability involves these specific MCDs, they really illustrate how those early architectural differences can have lasting effects on learning. It shows how deep these origins can go.
Like the foundation is just built a bit differently from the get-go.
Precisely. It's not typically something acquired later in life. It's part of the developmental process itself. And that's why the potential for really early identification and support is so compelling.
What about the brain's connections? The wiring, the white matter.
Yes. Think of white matter as the brain's highway system. Bundles of myelinated nerve fibers connecting different regions.
Okay.
If these highways aren't built quite optimally, if there are abnormalities in these tracks, communication gets impaired. Information doesn't travel as efficiently.
And that affects?
It impacts learning, memory, and definitely how quickly the brain can process things, processing speed. Research often points to abnormalities in specific white matter pathways, like the arcuate fasciculus in dyslexia, which connects key language areas.
So structural differences, whether it's the gray matter processing centers or the white matter communication highways, seem to be part of the picture present early on, really supporting this neurodevelopmental origin idea.
Absolutely. And the diversity of these structural differences we see across individuals helps explain why learning disabilities manifest so differently, even within, say, dyslexia. People can have quite different profiles.
Right. It underscores the need for understanding the individual brain profile.
Exactly.
Okay, moving beyond just structure, how does the brain work differently, functionally? Things like fMRI show us brain activity, right?
Yes, and this is where we see differences in how brain regions cooperate, how they work together. It's often not just a single area that's the issue, but how different parts of the brain function as networks.
Like teamwork problems.
Kind of, yeah. In learning disabilities, we frequently see what's called atypical functional connectivity. Brain regions just don't seem to communicate or synchronize their activity as effectively as they should for certain tasks.
Like the different sections of an orchestra aren't quite playing in time or coordinating smoothly.
That's a great analogy, yeah. For example, dyslexia is increasingly understood not just as a problem in a language area, but as a difficulty in integrating information across different brain systems. The visual system seeing the words, the auditory system processing sounds, the language system making sense of it all.
And that involves key connection points.
Often, yes. It can involve key hub regions, sort of like major airports in the brain's network, not connecting as efficiently to other areas.
And given how often learning disabilities co-occur with conditions like ADHD, do those also show these widespread network differences?
They certainly do. ADHD involves complex differences in large-scale brain networks, particularly those involving attention, executive functions, reward systems, you name it, frontostriatal circuits, parietal areas.
So understanding these networks is key for the comorbidity too.
Vitally important, yeah. Understanding how these networks function and connect helps explain why these conditions so often appear together.
The idea isn't just a broken part, but maybe more like a disconnection syndrome, problems with communication between brain areas.
That captures it really well. Even if individual brain areas seem relatively okay, if their ability to talk to each other effectively is compromised, it leads to inefficient processing and cognitive difficulties.
Which suggests maybe interventions could target those connections.
That's a key implication, yes. Targeting network communication and efficiency.
And the research also notes sometimes there's underactivation, but sometimes overactivation in certain areas. What's that about?
Yes, that adds another layer of complexity. You might see reduced activity hypoactivation in the brain areas typically used for a task, like reading.
Okay.
But sometimes you see increased activity hyperactivation in other areas, maybe areas not usually specialized for that task.
Is that the brain compensating?
That's often the hypothesis. It might be the brain trying to compensate, recruiting alternative, perhaps less efficient neural routes to try and get the job done, like taking the scenic route because the highway is congested.
But maybe not the best route.
Not always the most efficient, no. Distinguishing what's a core deficit versus what's a compensatory strategy, and whether that strategy is actually helpful or just effortful, is a really key area of ongoing research.
Okay. So while there are specific profiles for different learning disabilities, you mentioned earlier there's evidence of shared brain and cognitive issues across different types.
This is a really important theme that comes through in the research. We see significant overlaps,
In what areas?
particularly in fundamental cognitive processes like working memory, that mental workspace for holding and manipulating information and processing speed, how quickly the brain handles information.
And weaknesses there are common across the board.
Very common across various learning disabilities and also in ADHD. And these core processes rely on distributed brain networks, particularly those involving the frontal and parietal lobes areas crucial for higher level thinking.
Uh-huh. So this starts to explain why things like dyslexia and dyscalculia so often happen together in the same person.
Exactly. The high rate of co-occurrence or comorbidity strongly suggests they might stem from some shared underlying vulnerabilities in these general cognitive systems or the brain networks that support them.
Like the frontoparietal network.
Precisely. Think of the frontal lobes being crucial for executive functions like planning and attention, and the parietal lobes important for integrating different types of information, including spatial and numerical concepts. If these areas or the connections between them aren't working optimally,
It could cause ripples affecting both reading and math.
it could, depending on how that inefficiency interacts with more specific language or number systems in the brain, and maybe genetic factors too.
The sources describe this with a model focusing on core periphery network variability. What's that about?
That model basically suggests that some underlying variability or inefficiency in fundamental core brain networks, particularly those association areas that handle multiple types of information, could be a shared origin point. And then, depending on other factors, that core issue might manifest outwardly as difficulties primarily in reading or primarily in math or maybe both. It supports a view that these aren't always completely separate, isolated conditions.
So it's more like a spectrum or maybe different combinations of challenges stemming from shared vulnerabilities in core brain systems rather than totally distinct problems.
That's the dimensional view that's gaining traction. A weakness in a general brain network supporting, say, executive functions might show up differently, maybe as poor comprehension monitoring and reading or difficulty planning steps in math, depending on how it interacts with everything else.
That makes sense. It helps explain the complex profiles and the high comorbidity we see.
And it also suggests that maybe targeting these shared underlying deficits like working memory or executive function might be a really powerful intervention strategy, potentially helping across different areas. A transdiagnostic approach.
Right, treating the common root. Okay, let's zoom in on some specific examples now. Dyslexia, probably the most well-known learning disability. What does the brain picture consistently show there?
Okay, dyslexia. The primary neurological basis involves differences, primarily in the left hemisphere networks. Those networks responsible for language processing and also the visual processing involved specifically in reading.
Left hemisphere makes sense, since that's typically dominant for language in most people. What specific areas or pathways are most consistently implicated?
Well, the research consistently points to atypical structure or function in a network involving areas in the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes of the left hemisphere, key language and visual areas.
So less activity there during reading.
Often, yes, you often see reduced activation or sometimes atypical connectivity patterns in these regions when someone with dyslexia is doing a reading task compared to typical readers.
And what about those white matter highways connecting them? We talked about the arcuate fasciculus earlier.
Exactly. That one comes up a lot. There's frequent evidence suggesting reduced integrity or atypical development in the arcuate fasciculus. Remember, that's the major pathway connecting the brain's sound processing areas in the temporal lobe to language production and processing areas up in the frontal lobe.
And if that highway isn't efficient?
It severely impacts the rapid automatic processing needed to link letters to sounds, decode words fluently, and comprehend efficiently.
So it's like the connection between seeing the letters on the page and accessing the brain's sound system is somehow compromised or slower.
That's a very good way to put it, yes. And there's also a specific region in the left occipitotemporal cortex, often called the visual word form area, or VWFA.
The VWFA.
What does that do?
Think of it as the brain's specialized letterbox or word recognition unit. It becomes highly tuned to recognizing whole written words quickly and automatically in skilled readers. And in dyslexia. In individuals with dyslexia, this area is often smaller, or it shows reduced specialization. It doesn't activate as strongly or selectively for written words. And the sources highlighted that this VWFA difference, like its size or lack of specialization, can be a persistent trait even after someone gets really good reading intervention.
That's a really significant finding. Yes, it strongly supports the idea that these are inherent neurodevelopmental brain differences, not just a result of, say, not practicing reading enough.
So intervention helps build other pathways, but might not change that core structure.
Intervention is incredibly effective at building new pathways and strategies, definitely improving reading. But yeah, it may not fundamentally change the side or initial setup of this specific region. It really reinforces that neurodevelopmental origin. These differences are likely there very early on, maybe even before reading instruction starts.
It sounds like it's definitely not a single, simple problem, but a complex network issue involving multiple brain areas and their connections.
Absolutely. Differences in gray matter structure, white matter integrity, how these areas mature over time, maybe even myelination patterns, they all seem to contribute to the varied ways dyslexia can present.
Okay, functionally then, when someone with dyslexia is actually trying to read, what's happening differently in their brain activity?
Well, during reading tasks, those key left hemisphere areas we mentioned, the ones typically involved in linking print to sound, phonology, and rapidly recognizing words, orthography, they often show less activity, less engagement compared to typical readers.
Hypoactivation.
Hypoactivation, exactly. It's like those specialized parts of the brain aren't coming online as fully or efficiently for the reading task.
And you mentioned compensation earlier. Does that show up here too?
Yes, very often. You frequently see more activity or hyperactivation in other brain areas, particularly in corresponding areas in the right hemisphere, and also often in frontal brain regions associated with effort and attention.
So the brain's working harder, using other routes.
It looks like it. It looks like the brain is working harder, trying to use alternative, less specialized pathways to compensate for the inefficiency in the typical left hemisphere reading network. It helps explain, why reading can be so effortful, slow, and laborious for many individuals with dyslexia.
The brain is taking a less direct, more labor-intensive route to get to the same destination.
That's a good way to think about it. And that disconnection syndrome idea is very relevant here, too. It's not just about individual areas being broken, maybe, but about impaired coordination and communication between them, making the whole reading process inefficient.
Okay. And these brain differences then lead to specific cognitive difficulties, the things we can observe more directly. What are the core ones for dyslexia?
The most prominent, the most widely accepted core deficit is difficulty with phonological processing.
The sounds of language again.
Exactly. The ability to perceive, remember, and manipulate the individual sounds, the phonemes, within words. This is why you see difficulties with tasks like sounding out unfamiliar words, rhyming, segmenting words into sounds, and spelling accurately.
And that links directly back to those left hemisphere language networks.
Very strongly linked to atypical function in those left temporoparietal and inferior frontal regions we discussed.
So crucially, it's typically not a primary visual problem, right? They see the letters fine.
Generally, yes. It's about processing the sounds associated with those letters and words. Now, some individuals might also have some difficulties with auditory processing, especially subtle timing aspects of speech sounds, which can further impact phoneme perception. And related to this,
Working memory.
yes, difficulties specifically with verbal working memory, holding sequences of sounds or words in mind temporarily. This is essential for decoding longer words, understanding the meaning of complex sentences as you read them, or holding spelling patterns in mind while writing.
And processing speed comes up again here too.
It does, particularly when processing linguistic information rapidly. This is often measured by tasks like rapid automatized naming, or RAN, where you have to quickly name a series of familiar objects, colors, letters, or digits.
And slower speed on RAN is linked to reading.
Yes, slower performance on RAN tasks is highly predictive of difficulties, specifically with reading fluency, reading smoothly and accurately at a good pace. It seems to reflect the overall efficiency or inefficiency of the entire reading network engaging quickly.
The sources also briefly touch on a potential role for the cerebellum. What's that theory?
Yeah, the cerebellar deficit hypothesis suggests that subtle dysfunction in the cerebellum, which we know is involved in motor control, but also timing and automatizing skills, might contribute to the fluency and maybe even some phonological issues seen in dyslexia.
Is that widely accepted?
The evidence is more mixed and debated compared to the phonological deficit linked to the left hemisphere language areas. But it's out there, and it might help explain why some individuals with dyslexia also have mild motor coordination issues, for instance. It adds to the complex picture and the possibility of different subtypes.
Okay. So boiling it down for dyslexia, the core seems to be phonological processing difficulties, rooted in those left hemisphere language networks. But it's often part of a constellation that can include challenges with verbal working memory, processing speed, maybe even auditory processing or cerebellar function, each potentially impacting different aspects of reading like decoding, fluency, or comprehension.
That's a really good summary, yeah. And that processing speed issue, for example, can act like a bottleneck across the entire reading system. If you're slow at recognizing letters or accessing sounds, it slows everything down, retrieving word meanings, understanding the sentence. It all gets backed up.
Making fluency really hard.
Exactly. Understanding which of these specific cognitive areas are most impacted in a particular individual is really key for tailoring effective support.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears now to dyscalculia difficulties with math. What's the brain science look like for number challenges? Where are the key differences found?
Okay, dyscalculia. For math difficulties, the key brain players seem to be located primarily in the parietal lobes, especially a region tucked within the parietal lobe called the intraparietal sulcus, or IPS.
The IPS and the parietal lobe, what's its job?
These parietal areas, and the IPS in particular, are considered crucial for representing and processing numbers and quantities, our basic sense of how many.
So the brain's number sense center, maybe.
You could think of it that way, yeah. It's fundamental for that intuitive grasp of quantity.
And how do these areas look different structurally in dyscalculia?
Well, similar to dyslexia, studies often show structural differences. Things like reduced volume of gray matter in the parietal cortex, including around the IPS, sometimes also in nearby areas like the supramarginal gyrus, which is linked to retrieving math facts. And these differences can sometimes be seen quite early, even in childhood.
So structural differences in the core area for number sense, potentially from early on.
Yes. And again, like dyslexia, there can also be differences reported in the white matter tracts, casting these parietal areas to other important brain regions.
Like connecting to the frontal lobes for problem solving.
Exactly. Especially tracts connecting parietal regions to frontal regions involved in executive functions like planning, working memory, and attention. These connections are vital for integrating that basic quantity understanding with the higher level processes needed for complex math.
Okay, so that structure. How does the brain function differently in dyscalculia when someone is doing math?
Functionally, during math tasks, you often see atypical patterns of activation involving that key parietal region, the IPS, and the broader network it's part of.
What kind of atypical patterns?
A key finding that comes up repeatedly is reduced activity hypoactivation, particularly in the right IPS, especially when individuals are trying to process quantities non-symbolically, like comparing sets of dots without actually counting them.
So difficulty with that basic intuitive grasp of more or less, that fundamental number sense.
Exactly. The right IPS seems particularly strongly linked to that foundational non-symbolic number sense. Now, the functional picture can be complex, though.
How so?
Sometimes studies report increased overall brain activity, as if the brain is working much, much harder and recruiting more resources to do even basic math tasks. And sometimes there are findings of atypical connectivity, maybe even hyperconnectivity between certain areas.
Working harder, not smarter. Again, perhaps.
Possibly. Or maybe it reflects a less efficient, noisier system. And the sources also mention the hippocampus sometimes playing an interesting role.
The hippocampus.
Yeah.
That's usually associated with memory, right?
Exactly. And interestingly, you sometimes see increased activity in the hippocampus during symbolic math tasks, like dealing with numerals, in people with dyscalculia.
What might that mean?
Well, one interpretation is that when the intuitive quantity system linked to the IPS isn't working efficiently, the brain might try to compensate by relying more heavily on rote memory strategies mediated by the hippocampus.
So if the number sense isn't automatic, they might be trying to just memorize every single fact and procedure rather than understanding the concepts.
That's a plausible hypothesis supported by some of these findings. It would be a less efficient, more effortful, and probably less flexible approach to mathematics.
Makes sense. And like dyslexia, difficulties with connectivity are involved in dyscalculia too, especially that frontoparietal network.
Definitely. Atypical development and function within the frontoparietal network seems crucial. Remember, this network needs to integrate quantity information processed in the parietal lobe with higher-level control processes like planning, strategy selection, and working memory supported by the frontal lobes.
So if the communication lines are weak.
Impaired communication between the IPS and the prefrontal cortex, for instance, can make complex mathematical problem-solving much, much harder. It's difficult to keep track of quantities while also managing the steps of a problem.
Okay. So these brain differences, primarily in the parietal and frontoparietal networks, lead to specific cognitive challenges in math. What are the main ones?
Well, the most central cognitive deficit often discussed is in that core number sense or numerical cognition, that intuitive understanding of quantity we talked about.
How does that show up?
It shows up as difficulty with estimating quantities, comparing magnitudes, like which number is bigger, or quickly recognizing small quantities without counting something called subitizing. And this is strongly linked back to that IPS dysfunction.
Okay. What about using the actual symbols, like the numeral 3 or the word 3?
That's another potential area of difficulty, sometimes described as an access deficit. It's like difficulty fluently and automatically connecting the numerical symbols we use, like 7 or 7, to the actual quantity they represent.
So they might understand the quantity concept, but struggle to link it quickly to the symbol.
Potentially, yes. It's about the mapping between the symbol and its meaning. This might involve not just the parietal areas, but also visual areas in the brain that recognize number forms and the pathways connecting them to the quantity system.
Interesting. And the sources strongly highlighted visual-spatial working memory as being particularly important for math difficulties.
Yes, this seems to be a major area of vulnerability in many individuals with dyscalculia. Visuospatial working memory is your ability to hold and mentally manipulate visual and spatial information.
How is that used in math?
Think about keeping numbers aligned in columns for calculation, mentally rotating shapes in geometry, understanding graphs, visualizing a number line, even just keeping track of intermediate steps in multi-step problems. It's hugely important for math.
And the sources noted that even when someone has both reading and math difficulties, challenges with visual-spatial WM are often more strongly tied specifically to the math struggles.
That's a key finding, yes. It suggests a particular link between visuospatial skills and math proficiency, likely related to the parietal lobe's dual role in processing both space and number.
Okay. What about difficulty remembering arithmetic facts, like times tables?
Oh, that's a very common complaint. Difficulty automatically retrieving basic math facts, like 7 by 8 from long-term memory. This is thought to involve parietal areas important for fact retrieval, like the supramarginal gyrus, and, as we mentioned, potentially atypical reliance on the hippocampus if retrieval isn't automatic. Problems learning and consolidating those facts in the first place.
And procedural difficulties, too. Following the steps.
Yes, problems learning, remembering, and accurately applying the sequence of steps involved in mathematical procedures or algorithms, like the steps for long division or solving equations.
So, just like with dyslexia, it sounds like there might be different underlying cognitive pathways leading to dyscalculia. Maybe one profile rooted more in that fundamental quantity processing deficit, IPS, and perhaps another linked more to difficulties accessing quantity via symbols, or maybe major WM issues.
That's an emerging and important idea in the field, the concept of subtypes, that different profiles of dyscalculia might have slightly different core neurocognitive bases. It highlights the heterogeneity.
And that would mean interventions need to be targeted differently.
Exactly. For example, an intervention focusing intensely on building foundational number sense might be best for one profile, while another might benefit more from strategies strengthening the link between symbols and quantity, or support for working memory.
And that visual spatial working memory piece seems so critical, maybe because the parietal lobe, the number hub, is also heavily involved in spatial processing, a shared neural system vulnerability.
That's a strong hypothesis, yes. The overlap in the neural systems handling number and space makes visuospatial WM particularly crucial for many mathematical concepts that are inherently spatial. Think number lines, geometry, graphs, measurement.
Right, so much of math has a spatial component.
It really does.
And the fact, retrieval difficulties. It seems like they could often be a downstream consequence of these other underlying issues, right? If your number sense is weak, or accessing the meaning of symbols is slow, or your working memory is overloaded, it's going to be much harder to efficiently learn and automatically retrieve facts.
Absolutely. Fact retrieval problems are often a very visible symptom, but they can stem from these deeper difficulties. It could be poor quantity understanding, making the facts seem arbitrary, or slow symbol access, preventing automaticity, or WM limitations impacting the ability to encode and consolidate the facts into long-term memory in the first place.
So it's a symptom with potentially multiple underlying causes, needing careful assessment to figure out the why.
Precisely. A comprehensive assessment is vital to understand why someone is struggling with facts, not just that they are struggling. The sources included a useful table comparing some of these key points for dyslexia and dyscalculia, by the way.
Good reference point. Okay, so we have these specific brain and cognitive profiles for reading difficulties and math difficulties.
Yeah.
But we also kept touching on these broader domain general cognitive processes that seem critical and often impaired across different learning disabilities.
Yes, this is a really big piece of the puzzle. Beyond the challenges tied directly to reading or math skills themselves, several foundational cognitive abilities are essential for all learning. And weaknesses in these areas significantly contribute to learning challenges, often across multiple domains.
And working memory came up again and again. Let's revisit that specifically.
Right. Working memory, just to recap, is like your brain's temporary mental workspace, or scratch pad. It allows you to hold information in mind and manipulate it moment to moment, so you can do complex things like understand sentences, solve multi-step problems, follow directions, learn new things. It's absolutely fundamental.
And deficits there are really common in LDs.
Extremely common. You see working memory difficulties frequently in specific LDs like dyslexia and dyscalculia, and also very commonly in ADHD, which often co-occurs.
And we noted for dyslexia, it's often specifically verbal working memory that's weaker.
Yes, often challenges with holding and manipulating language-based information sequences of sounds, words, sentences. This is crucial for decoding, comprehending complex text, remembering instructions, even holding spelling patterns in mind while writing.
And for dyscalculia, the emphasis was more on visuospatial working memory.
That's often the case, yes. Difficulty holding and manipulating visual and spatial information mentally needed for things like keeping numbers aligned, remembering intermediate steps in a calculation, visualizing geometric shapes or graphs, understanding spatial relationships.
Neurocognitively, where do these working memory systems rely in the brain?
They depend heavily on dynamic coordinated activity within the frontoparietal network, that network connecting frontal control regions with parietal processing areas and interactions with other subcortical structures too. Working memory deficits are often linked to differences in how these brain networks activate and communicate during demanding WM tasks.
And different types of working memory, verbal versus visuospatial, might rely on slightly different parts or weightings within that same broader network.
That's the idea, yeah. Based on models like Baddeley's multi-component model, you have potentially different components like the phonological loop for verbal info and the visuospatial sketchpad for visual spatial info, possibly supported by somewhat distinct yet overlapping neural circuits within that larger frontoparietal system.
And those specific weaknesses tend to align with the types of challenges seen in different LDs.
Exactly. And it can become a bit of a vicious cycle, too. Underlying brain differences might limit working memory capacity to begin with,
Right.
and the sheer mental effort involved in struggling with reading or math tasks consumes even more of that already limited working memory capacity, making the task even harder.
Yeah, that makes sense. Processing speed was another big one you mentioned as domain general.
Yes, processing speed. Simply put, it's how quickly you can perceive information, make sense of it, and then respond. It's a measure of the basic efficiency or cognitive tempo of your neural system.
And it's important to stress again, slow processing speed can happen even in very bright, intelligent people.
Absolutely. It's considered largely independent of overall intelligence or reasoning ability. You can be incredibly smart and still process information more slowly than average.
How does slower processing speed impact learning across the board?
It can create a bottleneck for many academic tasks. It affects how quickly you can read fluently and comprehend what you're reading, how quickly you can perform calculations or solve math problems, especially under time pressure, how easily you can take notes while listening, or even follow fast-paced classroom discussions or instructions.
So it impacts fluency and keeping up.
Big time. In dyslexia, it clearly contributes to slow, choppy reading and difficulties with timed tasks like RAN. In dyscalculia, it impacts math fluency, speed of calculation, and often leads to problems finishing tests within the time limits.
And neurocognitively, what's thought to underlie processing speed?
It likely relates to the overall efficiency of neural transmission, how quickly signals travel along nerve fibers, influenced by factors like myelination and the efficiency of communication and organization within large-scale brain networks, particularly involving the frontal lobes. Also, the efficiency of specific processing areas, like the VWFA for reading speed, plays a role.
It sounds like a fundamental efficiency factor that can hinder performance across many different areas.
It really can. It acts as a transdiagnostic bottleneck, potentially slowing down performance in any area that requires rapid processing. This highlights why it's so important to consider time constraints when evaluating performance. Poor scores on timed tests might reflect slow speed rather than a lack of knowledge or understanding. Crucial for diagnosis and thinking about accommodations.
Definitely. Attentional control was also listed as a key domain general process.
Right. Attentional control refers to a set of abilities, selectively focusing on relevant information while ignoring distractions, sustaining concentration over time, and flexibly shifting attention between different tasks or stimuli as needed.
All crucial for learning in a busy classroom or workplace.
Absolutely. And these abilities are heavily dependent on networks involving the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, and other structures like the anterior cingulate cortex.
And difficulties here are common in LDs.
Yes, difficulties with various aspects of attention are frequently reported not just in ADHD, but also alongside LDs. Autism, anxiety, it's quite common.
And it's more nuanced than just being generally inattentive or distracted.
Much more nuanced, it can involve specific weaknesses. For instance, some research in dyslexia points to difficulties with rapidly shifting visual attention, or a limited visual attention span affecting how many letters can be processed at once. Others might struggle more with sustaining focus during effortful tasks, or dividing attention between listening and writing.
And these attentional difficulties would interact with the primary LD challenges, right?
Absolutely. It's hard to sustain attention on decoding text if the decoding process itself is incredibly slow and effortful. The attentional system gets fatigued or overwhelmed.
And you mentioned the link with anxiety earlier. How does that fit with attention?
Anxiety can significantly impair attentional control, particularly executive aspects like inhibiting distracting thoughts or efficiently shifting focus. Given that academic struggles often lead to anxiety, and anxiety can worsen attention needed for learning, you can get trapped in a really detrimental feedback loop. Difficulties breed anxiety, anxiety impairs attention, impaired attention worsens the academic difficulties.
Wow, yeah. That's a tough cycle. Finally, let's talk about executive functions, the EFs. These seem really central.
They absolutely are. Executive functions are those higher-level, top-down cognitive processes that allow us to manage ourselves and our resources to achieve goals. They're like the brain's CEO or air traffic control system.
What kinds of skills fall under EFs?
It's a broad set, including things like planning and organizing tasks or materials, initiating work, inhibiting impulsive responses, monitoring your own performance, mental flexibility or shifting strategies, emotional regulation, and importantly, working memory itself is often considered a key component of EF.
So skills critical for academic success and just navigating daily life effectively.
Totally critical. And EF deficits are very common in individuals with learning disabilities and ADHD, significantly impacting their academic progress, independence, and overall functioning.
How might EF weaknesses show up in dyslexia, for example?
You might see difficulties with planning and organizing written assignments, like essays, trouble managing time effectively for long-term projects, difficulty keeping track of information mentally while reading complex texts related to working memory, challenges regulating attention and effort during demanding reading tasks. Some research suggests EF weaknesses might even precede the formal LD diagnosis.
And in dyscalculia, how are EFs involved in math?
EFs are hugely involved in math, especially beyond basic facts. Planning the steps to solve a multi-step problem, organizing information spatially or sequentially, holding intermediate results in working memory, inhibiting irrelevant information or procedures, flexibly shifting between different strategies. These all rely heavily on EFs. The frontal regions supporting EFs work closely with parietal regions for math.
Neurocognitively, where are EFs primarily managed in the brain?
The prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead, is considered the main hub for executive functions. But it relies on extensive connections with many other brain areas, especially parietal regions and subcortical structures.
And the prefrontal cortex matures relatively late, right?
Yeah.
Into early adulthood.
That's a really important point. Yes, the PFC and the executive functions it supports have a protracted developmental trajectory, continuing to develop well into the 20s for some aspects.
Which means EF challenges might become more apparent or more problematic as academic and life demands increase.
Exactly. The need for strong independent planning, organization, time management, and self-regulation ramps up significantly in middle school, high school, college, and the workplace. Underlying EF weaknesses that might have been less noticeable earlier can become significant barriers at these later stages. This highlights the need for ongoing EF support and strategy instruction, not just in early grades.
And like working memory, ES seem to have a bidirectional relationship with LDs too.
Yes, weaknesses in executive functions can definitely make it harder to learn new academic skills efficiently from the start. And conversely, the chronic frustration, high cognitive load, and effort involved in managing a learning disability day in and day out can further strain or deplete executive function resources, particularly things like sustained effort, motivation, and emotional regulation. So it can be both a contributing factor and an area that's exacerbated by the LD itself.
Okay, so pulling these core cognitive processes together, working memory, processing speed, attentional control, and executive functions, they don't exist in isolation. The research emphasizes they co-occur, they interact, and they create these really complex individual profiles, all linked back to the functioning of widespread brain networks, especially those frontoparietal systems.
Precisely. And this interplay is seen as a key factor underlying the high rates of comorbidity we see children having more than one LD, or LD plus ADHD. For instance, research shows individuals with comorbid reading and math disabilities often show more severe deficits in things like working memory and processing speed than those with only one LD.
Suggesting maybe a shared vulnerability factor.
Exactly. It points towards the idea of perhaps a more general vulnerability in these foundational cognitive systems or the neural networks supporting them. Weaknesses here can disrupt the development of multiple academic skill areas.
And the specific learning disability that manifests, whether it's primarily reading or math or both, might depend on how these general weaknesses interact with more domain-specific brain networks, like the language network versus the number network, maybe genetic predispositions, and the precise pattern, severity, and combination of these general cognitive weaknesses.
That's a very good way to synthesize it, yes. And their combined impact is often multiplicative, not just additive. Meaning, for example, having both slow processing speed and limited working memory is much more detrimental than just having one of those weaknesses. The slow speed puts extra strain on the already limited working memory, making complex tasks like reading comprehension incredibly difficult. Slow decoding plus weak working memory often equals comprehension failure, even if vocabulary is good.
Wow, that really underscores the need for comprehensive assessment that looks at all these interacting deficits to understand the full picture.
Absolutely. You need to understand the interplay to guide effective intervention that considers the combined impact. The sources have another helpful table summarizing these core cognitive processes and their roles.
Okay. This understanding of the neurocognitive profiles, both the specific ones for dyslexia and dyscalculia, and the role of these core underlying processes, it really seems to move us beyond just describing academic struggles to understanding their origins, their root causes.
That's exactly the goal. That's the power of this perspective.
Yeah.
It leads us to the value of neurocognitive profiling.
Which is,
It's essentially using an integrated assessment approach, combining information about brain function, maybe indirectly through cognitive tests, or sometimes more directly with neuroimaging and research, with detailed assessment of cognitive abilities to link an individual's learning difficulties back to their specific underlying neural and cognitive variations. It illuminates the why.
so explicitly linking the neurological variations we talked about earlier, like differences in brain structure or function, to the specific cognitive impairments we just discussed, like weak phonological processing or slow processing speed.
That's the core idea. You try to trace the pathway. Specific differences in brain structure, function, or connectivity seem to lead to specific cognitive weaknesses, like poor phonological awareness or limited visuospatial WM, which in turn cause the observable learning difficulties in reading or math.
Can you give those examples again?
Sure. For dyslexia, atypical function or structure in the left hemisphere language network is linked to the core phonological processing deficit. Specific abnormalities in the VWFA are linked to difficulties with rapid automatic word recognition, orthographic processing. Reduced integrity in the arcuate ossiculus is linked to problems with decoding and fluency.
And for dyscalculia.
Atypical structure or function in parietal regions, especially the IPS, is linked to deficits in number sense and quantity processing. Atypicalities in the frontoparietal network connectivity are linked to difficulties integrating numerical understanding with executive functions needed for complex problem solving.
And the domain general deficits.
Weaknesses in things like executive functions, working memory, or attentional control are linked to differences in those large-scale brain networks, particularly involving the prefrontal cortex and frontoparietal systems.
So, if a neuropsychological assessment shows, say, that a student who struggles with reading comprehension has specific weaknesses in verbal working memory and phonological awareness, and we know those cognitive skills are linked to the function of specific left hemisphere brain networks, that provides a much deeper understanding.
Exactly. It provides convergent evidence for the root causes. It strengthens the diagnosis beyond just looking at academic test scores or classroom behavior. It allows us to form more precise hypotheses about how the underlying neurological differences are leading to the learning difficulty. For instance, maybe reduced white matter integrity in the arcuate fasciculus is impeding efficient information transfer between temporal and frontal language areas, directly causing the decoding bottleneck.
And understanding that how is crucial for refining our models and developing more targeted interventions, right?
Absolutely essential.
And neurocognitive profiles are also really valuable for differentiating LDs from other issues, and especially for understanding those complex comorbid cases we keep mentioning.
Yes, vital on both fronts. A detailed cognitive profile can help distinguish a specific learning disability from, say, struggles due purely to lack of instruction, or from a primary emotional disturbance, although these things can coexist, of course.
And for comorbidity, like someone with both dyslexia and ADHD.
Neurocognitive profiling is crucial there. We know comorbidity is common, often linked to those shared underlying cognitive deficits we discussed, like WM, processing speed, EFs, and potentially shared vulnerabilities in neural substrates, like the frontoparietal networks.
So the profile can help tease apart the contributions.
Exactly. It allows us to disentangle the relative contributions of different underlying issues. In a child with dyslexia and ADHD, for example, the profile might show weaknesses characteristic of dyslexia, example phonological deficits linked to left language networks, and separate weaknesses characteristic of ADHD, neuroimaging, executive function deficits like inhibition or sustained attention linked more to frontostriatal circuits. Neuroimaging in research settings can even show distinct and overlapping neural patterns.
So you get a much more nuanced understanding than just stacking labels.
Precisely. It helps identify the specific pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And identifying those shared vulnerabilities, like maybe an executive function deficit impacting both reading comprehension and behavioral regulation, informs more integrated intervention strategies. Maybe targeting that shared EF weakness could provide broader benefits across both academic and behavioral domains. It supports a more transdiagnostic approach.
Okay, this deeper understanding of the neurocognitive underpinnings clearly has really significant implications for how we should approach diagnosis and intervention for learning disabilities.
It really should fundamentally shift the approach moving forward.
How so? Traditionally, diagnosis often waited until a child was already struggling significantly in school, right? waiting for academic failure.
Yes, historically it was often reactive, a wait-to-fail model, unfortunately. The promise of neurocognitive research is the potential to enhance diagnostic accuracy, enable much earlier identification, and possibly even move towards preventative approaches by using reliable neurobiological and cognitive markers.
So using brain scans or cognitive tests to spot risk before failure happens.
That's the long-term vision. Things like functional brain imaging, looking at activation patterns in pre-readers, have shown correlations with later dyslexia risk in research studies. Certain cognitive tests tapping into precursor skills like phonological awareness or number sense can also identify at-risk children very early. Some brain measures might even eventually predict who will respond best to which type of intervention better than behavioral measures alone.
And neuropsychological assessments, which are more clinically available now, are already doing this to some extent.
Yes, clinical neuropsychological evaluations aim to do exactly this profile, cognitive strengths and weaknesses in areas like memory, attention, language, executive functions, to explicitly link observed learning difficulties back to underlying cognitive processes and likely brain function, pinpointing the specific nature of the learning gap.
So the ultimate goal is a paradigm shift. Identify risk early and intervene proactively, rather than waiting for problems to become entrenched and harder to fix.
Precisely. We know from developmental science that early, timely interventions are generally much more effective than later remediation. The major challenges, of course, are making sophisticated tools like neuroimaging accessible, affordable, and ensuring they have robust individual predictive power, not just showing group differences in research.
And standardizing methods, getting normative data.
All of that. Cost effectiveness is another huge factor. For now, comprehensive neuropsychological testing is often the most practical and accessible method for getting that detailed neurocognitive profile in a clinical or school setting.
And this deeper neurocognitive understanding also directly informs how we should design interventions. It's not just about diagnosis.
Absolutely. It's perhaps even more powerful for intervention. Knowing the specific neurocognitive weaknesses underlying an individual's learning disability allows us to tailor interventions much more precisely.
So if dyslexia is primarily rooted in phonological processing difficulties linked to atypical language network function,
Then interventions should logically focus on intensive, explicit training in phonological awareness and phonics, directly targeting that mechanism and the related brain networks.
and if dyscalculia seems primarily driven by core number sense deficits linked to parietal lobe function,
Then interventions should prioritize activities designed to build fundamental quantity understanding, number relationships, and estimation skills, targeting those parietal systems and frontoparietal connections.
and the amazing thing is, the brain's ability to change neuroplasticity is central to this whole approach, isn't it?
It's the absolute foundation of hope here. The brain isn't fixed. It retains a capacity for change and reorganization throughout life in response to experience and targeted training. That's neuroplasticity.
And we have evidence that effective interventions do lead to brain changes.
Yes, we do. Studies have shown that evidence-based reading interventions can lead to positive changes in brain activation patterns and connectivity in individuals with dyslexia, often showing increased activity in those left hemisphere areas closer to typical patterns. Similarly, effective math tutoring has been shown to induce neuroplastic changes in brain areas involved in numerical cognition in children with dyscalculia.
Wow. So interventions can actually reshape brain circuits.
To some extent, yes. There's even emerging research exploring technologies like non-invasive brain stimulation, like TES, to potentially enhance learning or intervention effects, although that's still in very early stages.
So the powerful message here is that learning disabilities aren't necessarily immutable, fixed conditions. The brain can adapt and improve with the right kind of input.
Exactly. It suggests that targeted, intensive, evidence-based interventions can genuinely help reshape neural circuits and improve function. It moves beyond just accommodating weaknesses to potentially remediating them at a neurocognitive level.
And the most effective interventions would be highly individualized based on that detailed neurocognitive profile we talked about.
Without question. Understanding whether the primary barrier for a particular student is phonological processing, or visuospatial working memory, or processing speed, or executive function, or a specific combination, allows for a truly personalized intervention approach. You target the identified root cause or bottleneck to maximize the potential for meaningful change and improvement.
That's a very hopeful perspective. However, despite all this exciting research, you often hear there's still a significant gap between the neuroscience lab and getting these insights and practices effectively into schools and clinics.
That translation gap is definitely a major challenge. Yes. Neuroscience is inherently complex, and it's often difficult to take findings from, say, an fMRI study on groups of people and translate them directly into practical, scalable strategies for individual students in a busy classroom or clinical setting.
And that's where you sometimes get misinterpretations or oversimplifications leading to
Yeah.
neuromyths.
Precisely. Things like the idea that people are strictly left-brained or right-brained, or that using colored overlays will cure dyslexia. These are often based on misunderstandings or misapplications of genuine neuroscience findings. They can lead to ineffective, sometimes costly practices. Addressing these neuromyths is crucial.
So building better bridges between the researchers, the clinical and school psychologists who do assessments, and the educators and therapists who deliver interventions seems absolutely key.
Essential. We need stronger collaboration and communication channels. Neuroscientists need to communicate findings clearly and accessibly. Practitioners need training to critically evaluate neuroscience claims. School psychologists are often well positioned to bridge this gap.
So effective translation needs more than just publishing papers.
Much more. It requires developing practical strategies, tools, and resources based on the science. Maybe co-production models, where researchers and practitioners work together from the start. Ongoing dialogue, professional development. It's a continuous process.
Yeah.
We need to ensure practices are genuinely neuroscience-informed, not just neuroscience-inspired myths.
Makes sense. Looking ahead now, the field is obviously dynamic and evolving rapidly. What are some of the big current research trends and future directions mentioned in the sources?
Well, one major area is definitely continued advancements in neuroimaging and, importantly, the analytical techniques used to make sense of that complex data.
Like using AI and machine learning.
Exactly. AI and machine learning algorithms are being increasingly applied to analyze large, complex data sets from MRI, fMRI, EEG, etc. The hope is they can identify subtle patterns or predictive signatures that might not be obvious with traditional analyses.
To do what? Improve diagnosis.
Potentially, yes. To develop more accurate, objective, and maybe even earlier diagnostic models based on brain data. Also, AI could potentially be used to help personalize learning algorithms or interventions based on an individual's specific neurocognitive profile.
So finding hidden patterns in the data and tailoring learning experiences.
That's the promise. Combining sophisticated imaging with powerful analytics could really help refine our models of LDs, identify meaningful subtypes, and maybe discover novel biomarkers for early detection or predicting treatment response.
Are there ethical considerations there?
Oh, absolutely. Big ones. Data privacy, the risk of algorithmic bias if the training data isn't representative, the black box problem of understanding why an AI makes a certain prediction, ensuring equitable access to these technologies. Responsible application is key.
Right. Another big area is genetics and now epigenetics.
Definitely. We've known for a long time that learning disabilities have strong genetic underpinnings. They run in families. They're highly heritable. Research continues to identify candidate genes, but it's complex. It's typically polygenic, many genes, each with a small effect.
And there's genetic overlap between different conditions.
Yes, significant genetic overlap is found between different LDs, like dyslexia and dyscalculia, and also with other neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD, reinforcing the idea of shared biological pathways or vulnerabilities.
And epigenetics adds another layer, how environment influences genes.
Exactly. Epigenetics studies how environmental factors can modify how our genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Things like methylation marks on DNA can act like dimmer switches, turning gene activity up or down.
How does that relate to LDs?
Research is exploring how environmental factors, both positive, like high-quality instruction, and negative, like early life stress or toxin exposure, might lead to epigenetic changes that influence brain development and cognitive functions relevant to learning. It's about the intricate interplay between genes and environment.
So it's definitely not purely genetic destiny then.
Not at all. The polygenic nature plus this crucial gene-environment interaction means that the environment, including things like the quality of teaching and intervention, plays a huge role in shaping outcomes. Positive environments might buffer genetic risk, while adverse environments might exacerbate it via epigenetic mechanisms.
So epigenetics could offer new avenues for prevention or intervention.
That's the hope. Understanding how adverse exposures might lead to negative epigenetic changes affecting learning versus how positive environments or interventions might promote more favorable epigenetic profiles could open up novel approaches focused on mitigating genetic risks through environmental factors. It's a really exciting frontier.
Longitudinal studies, following individuals over time, also seem absolutely critical for understanding how these conditions develop.
Absolutely critical, yes. By following the same individuals over months or years, starting early in life, researchers can map the developmental trajectories of both brain structure and function and cognitive skills.
What can that tell us?
It allows us to identify potential early neurocognitive markers that predict who is likely to develop learning difficulties later on. It's essential for validating early identification methods. It also lets us assess the long-term impact of LDs and the effectiveness of different interventions over time.
So really getting at that developmental story.
Exactly. And crucially, longitudinal designs help clarify cause and effect. Are certain brain differences observed in older children with LDs precursors that cause the difficulty, or are they perhaps consequences of struggling to learn? For example, are VWFA atypicalities present before children start struggling with reading? Longitudinal studies are needed to establish that temporal sequence.
What are the challenges with longitudinal research, especially starting very young?
Major challenges include developing assessment tools that are sensitive, specific, and feasible to use with very young children. And of course, the ethical considerations around potentially identifying risk very early, ensuring appropriate support is available, avoiding stigma or self-fulfilling prophecies. It requires careful frameworks.
Another big trend mentioned is the increasing focus on comorbidity and adopting more dimensional approaches to diagnosis.
Yes, the extremely high rates of comorbidity individuals having more than one LD or an LD plus ADHD, etc., really challenges purely categorical views of these conditions as entirely separate boxes.
So moving towards seeing abilities on a continuum.
Exactly. Dimensional approaches view abilities like reading, math, attention, or working memory as existing on a continuum across the population. Learning difficulties arise when an individual's skills in one or more areas fall below a certain threshold needed to meet environmental demands. This perspective often better captures the reality of individual profiles, which frequently involve a mix of relative strengths and weaknesses across different domains.
So instead of just assigning a label, you focus on assessing the individual's profile across a range of relevant neurocognitive abilities.
Precisely. It emphasizes individualized profiling regardless of specific diagnostic labels. And research is actively exploring the shared versus distinct neurobiology in comorbid cases to understand the mechanisms.
Why is understanding comorbidity mechanisms so important?
Understanding whether comorbidity arises from shared genetic factors or common underlying cognitive deficits like executive dysfunction, or maybe even causal relationships. For example, does early ADHD impact the acquisition of reading skills? Is vital for developing truly integrated interventions that address the interacting difficulties effectively. Maybe targeting shared frontoparietal dysfunction could help both ADHD symptoms and related learning issues.
Makes sense. Finally, the sources highlighted the need for more ecologically valid assessments and also preventative interventions. What's meant by ecologically valid assessment?
Ecological validity refers to how well an assessment task reflects the cognitive demands of real-world situations like the classroom, the playground, or the workplace. Many traditional, highly structured cognitive tests might not fully capture how someone functions in complex, dynamic, distraction-filled environments.
So tests need to mimic real life better.
That's the idea. Particularly for things like executive functions planning, organization, managing distractions while trying to complete a task. We need assessment tools that better simulate these real-world demands to get a more accurate picture of functional abilities and challenges. Some newer assessments use virtual reality or more complex performance tasks to try and achieve this.
So the assessment results are more relevant to planning real-world support.
Exactly. It helps bridge the gap between test performance and real-life challenges, informing more relevant diagnoses and interventions.
And preventative interventions. We touched on this with early identification.
Yes, this builds on the idea of early identification based on neuroscience insights. It's about developing and implementing interventions that target known early precursors or risk factors for learning difficulties before significant problems emerge.
Like bolstering foundational skills.
Exactly. Targeting things like phonological awareness in pre-readers known to be at risk, or number sense skills in preschoolers. Frameworks like the RDOC initiative from NIMH, which try to link specific neurobiological mechanisms to behavioral dimensions, can help facilitate this translation from basic neuroscience to targeted early, potentially preventative interventions.
So shifting the focus from deficit remediation after failure towards a more proactive, public health-oriented model of developmental support.
That's the vision. Identifying at-risk children early and providing targeted support to bolster foundational neurocognitive skills aims to optimize developmental trajectories and hopefully prevent difficulties from escalating into significant disabilities later on.
This has been an incredibly rich and, well, deep dive into the brain science behind learning differences. To try and pull it all together, what's the most crucial takeaway message you think listeners should hold on to?
I think the absolute core takeaway is that learning disabilities are complex, multifaceted neurodevelopmental conditions. They are rooted in genuine differences in brain structure, function, and connectivity. Crucially, they are not a reflection of a person's intelligence or how hard they are trying, but rather a result of how their individual brain is wired to process specific types of information.
And we've unpacked how that looks in different areas, those distinct neurocognitive profiles often seen in dyslexia, involving left hemisphere language networks, the VWFA, the arcuate fasciculus, and in dyscalculia, involving parietal areas like the IPS and frontoparietal networks, crucial for number sense and math reasoning.
Exactly. And alongside those specific profiles, we've underscored the critical, often overlapping role of those domain general cognitive processes, working memory, processing speed, attentional control, and executive functions, which are supported by distributed brain networks and are fundamental for learning across the board.
The path forward, then, seems to lie in continued interdisciplinary research, better translation of those findings into improved diagnostic tools, like using neurocognitive markers for earlier, more precise identification, and developing increasingly targeted interventions.
Interventions that really leverage our understanding of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity for change, and are tailored to the individual's specific neurocognitive profile.
And the promise of moving towards more early, preventative strategies based on this growing body of science feels incredibly significant.
It really does. It offers a much more hopeful and proactive vision for supporting all learners effectively.
Okay, so understanding these neurocognitive underpinnings, it doesn't just explain the difficulties people face. It really reveals the brain's incredible capacity for change and adaptation. So my final thought for you, the listener, building on everything we've explored today, is this. How does knowing this shift the narrative? How does it move us from seeing disability purely as a deficit towards viewing these differences as variations in brain processing variations that can be understood, supported, and potentially remediated through targeted, science-informed approaches? What does this neurocognitive perspective really mean for how we can better support all learners, appreciating the inherent diversity of individual brain blueprints?
That's a powerful question to consider, a really important one.